didn't go.
Okay.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Pax What She Said podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Maggie Loney, joined as always by Perry Goldstein. And what's so funny is that I watched Pack-A-Day earlier with the wonderful Andy Herman with special guest Perry Goldstein, and Andy coughed in the middle of his intro. And I was like, that's really funny. I'm glad he left that in there. And then with our intro, we couldn't get the video to play. So it is just the most Monday to Monday here over in the Packers content creators sphere. But Perry, we're talking about a Packers preseason victory. How are you doing?
I was so happy to come home yesterday. I will say I didn't watch the game live. I watched a replay, but I was so happy to come home on a Sunday morning, drink my coffee, and watch some Packers play some live game reps. I know that it's preseason, but it's real. It's a game. It's glorious. And it means we're one step closer to week one. So feeling good.
Yeah, not much to complain about. I mean, we saw obviously the Packers starters got to play for a little bit. Jordan Love went out there, threw a touchdown in his second snap or his second pass, and they were like, "All right, this is fine." Dontavian Wicks, his one snap, it was a touchdown, and it's like, yeah, I think now we just wrap the starters in bubble wrap until Brazil. Just get them on the plane, get them down there now. Just don't even worry about it. Just lock them up. But really, what do you think? I mean, do you think the Packers start anyone else this season, or do you think it's kind of locked up? Matt LaFleur basically said they weren't going to play for week 2, but do you think we see him week 3 at all, or do you think this was it for them?
I think it's fine. I think I understand why week 1, maybe after missing some time together, let's get out there, let's get a series, see how we feel. But I'm with you. Put them in bubble wrap, have them at practice, get ready for week 1. I think there's a multitude of factors that go into whether the starters play. We like to make jokes, and obviously it's 1A is protecting everyone from injury. But as long as the starters are playing, the rest of the guys who are fighting for roster spots are not playing. And I think that's what really preseason is actually about. It's about that. It's about, getting the team together and players who haven't played together yet, getting that time. So the rookies, any of the new free agents, getting that time on the field. It's about the defensive coordinator getting time to put what he's been teaching them in practice and in meeting rooms on the field for the first time. So all those things are important. But I think really, and this is what a lot of our show is going to be about, is it's about these depth guys who are trying to make the case for why they should be on the 53 or even on the practice squad, why they should, make that cut versus not. And as long as the starters are out there, they don't get that opportunity really. So we know what we have in Jordan Love and Dontavian Wicks and Christian Watson and Josh Jacobs and all the guys who we are going to watch in Brazil. And I just think there's no reason to have them out there anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it would be different as well if the Packers weren't doing joint practices with the Broncos and Ravens. But since they're seeing both teams before the preseason games, flying out to Denver early for those joint reps, and then, of course, the Ravens coming to Reineke Field to practice with the Packers beforehand, you're going to see the one-on-one matchups with, the Broncos' first-string defense, with the Ravens' first-string defense, and it won't be live tackling. So as much as, that does matter to an extent, it's a little bit safer, but still giving your starters some valuable reps against the talent that they likely will be seeing, during the regular season and not during the preseason. So let's go ahead then and jump into some players that stood out the most. And I think you could make the case for a ton of guys. So I'm really curious, who your first choice will be here.
Okay. I just want to say, I think you make an excellent point there with the joint practices. It is a nice just a nice balance. So excellent point there to my co-host. I have 3 guys that come to mind immediately.
Okay.
So I'll start with one. One of them is actually one of your favorite guys. So we'll get there, I'm sure. But
Can't wait.
I think he's been a little bit of, we'll start here. He's been a little bit of like a camp darling, a dark horse within this wide receiver room. And I would be remiss if we didn't potentially start here with Grant Dubose. Going into the season, going into the off season, I don't know if I would have ever brought his name up at this point, saying, yes, I think this guy deserves a roster spot. But here we are, right? This is what the offseason, preseason is all about, having guys make the most of their opportunities. And he has come out basically after a red shirt's first season, and really done that. I think he has made all of the most of his opportunities, especially with Bo Melton not having the best showing in his first preseason game, with Malik Heath also not doing much, although I think both those guys can certainly and will make their case for why they should be on the roster, whether it's from a special teams perspective or because of their past history on this team. But this is a really, really deep wide receiver room with a lot of really awesome young talent, and Grant Dubose is showing why he should be on this team, making catches, blocking, right? Not just out in the passing game, but the most important thing is why Matt LaFleur adds guys to this roster is what they do holistically when they're doing their 111th, when they're not just catching the ball and running routes. So what are they blocking? And he's doing all those things, and he's doing them consistently. So I think if he puts together another 2 games of what we saw on Saturday, to me, it would be really hard to see him not make this roster. But then the Packers have 7 wide receivers. And then you get into that question of whether they keep that many.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit before. The first preseason game was 1 through 4 in your wide receiver depth chart. However you rank them, doesn't matter. Yeah. Matt LaFleur said today, everybody can be a wide receiver 1. Those 4 are locked in. But that 5, the 6, the 7, depending on how many the Packers want to keep, that's where things get really tricky, because Malik Heath and Bo Melton obviously are the incumbents there. We saw them play really nicely in the little stretches that they got, but they've been a little bit quieter. I mean, Bo Melton has had a really nice camp, but it, kind of struggled a little bit with drops in the preseason game. So possibly shaking the rust off, or maybe it's the quarterbacks he's playing with. We don't fully know the answers to some of that stuff, but yeah, Grant Dubose, I think, making a really, really strong case to be the 5th or 6th guy. And that's when things get really interesting. Did you have anybody else? You want me to go next? Okay.
Yeah. Well, who's your guy?
All right. One of the guys, I think they're kind of a tandem, but I'm going to take Sean Ryan and Jacob Monk, because I thought that some of their blocking was just so fantastic. There's, a play where Sean Ryan is pulling and he's almost like dragging Emmanuel Wilson with him. And Jacob Monk was out in front as well for that one. Sean Ryan took some snaps at center, which we don't historically see. Haven't seen a ton from him. And Adam Stenavich basically said after the fact that unless you're like a first-round pick getting selected to play in a premium, if you're a depth guy, you are cross-trained. Like, that is what you do. You have to be able to play just about everywhere. So we've kind of penciled Sean Ryan in as like the 3rd best guard behind Morgan and Jenkins, but I think he's making a really strong case to be the interior piece, even as a backup center. Jacob Monk, I think, looks good, but he's also a rookie. Sean Ryan's been around 3 seasons now, so this is probably his best shot to latch onto the roster as like O-line 6. So really liked both of their games and thought that it'll be fun to see some more of them in the next couple weeks, but really, really impressive run blocking out of those 2 big guys.
Yeah, the swing interior offensive lineman. Is that where he is making his name potentially? Which, again, important, very important. We don't know what's going to happen at center, and injuries occur along the line all the time. So to have someone that they feel really confident in to slot in any of those 3 positions is huge. I definitely agree with you with Jacob Monk. I know we were both excited about him coming out of the draft, and he's for sure a little bit more developmental than Sean Ryan. I think Sean Ryan could go into the season as a starter, whereas I don't see Jacob Monk being a starter potentially. unless something either catastrophic and or largely exponential developmental happens with Jacob Monk over the next 2 weeks. But both for where they are in their development and where your expectations are for them going into this season, I agree. I thought they had great games. And I think, and I had this conversation with Andy Herman on said Pack-A-Day show, that similarly to the wide receiver room, the O-line room, O-lineman 7 through 10, that back half is still a little bit of a toss-up. So the rest of this preseason, depending how each individual guy plays, could make or break whether they cling on to this roster.
And I think what's really interesting too is, you talk about probably Sean Ryan and Jacob Monk being your 2 interior guys. So assuming both of them aren't starters, that already puts you at 7. But then you've got Travis Glover, who was a draft pick, who we haven't seen a ton of. We know how Goody feels about his draft picks. So you could argue that he has a roster spot given his draft pedigree. But then you've got 3 big swing tackles that are all kind of competing. You've got Andre Dillard, Kadeem Telfort, Caleb Jones. We saw all 3 of them. It sounds like Dillard is playing a little bit better than he had previously. Telfort, it sounded like struggled a little bit in the preseason. So every time you think that somebody's like making a case and they're edging towards a roster spot, then we kind of sink back into reality. And we have 12, 13 guys, Luke Tenuta. There's a lot of vets on the team too. Royce Newman, that you just don't know how that's going to shake out. So I know that, we talk about the starters here and the 53-man roster, but I know Matt LaFleur is also really big on saying like this is a 69-man team. Like we're taking our 16 practice squad members who can be called up at any moment, any given Sunday. So those are some vital spots too for the guys that might not get on the initial 53.
Yeah, it's going to come down to the wire, I think, over the next 2 weeks for sure when it comes to the offensive line. I'm going to switch to the other side of the ball to talk about my next player, mostly because I also know you probably want to talk about him, but I think that the conversation is broader around this room as well. But I thought Evan Williams really stood out to me in this game. He stood out in camp, but he stood out 33. He was all over the field, making tackles everywhere, and just really making a case for why he should be getting like potentially significant playing time when this season starts. The Packers went heavy on safeties this offseason, as we know. They invested draft capital money in free agency on like completely rebuilding this room. And so far in general, I've been supremely impressed with not just him, but Javon Bullard. And obviously we have the Xavier McKinney of it all. And you can't forget either about Anthony Johnson Jr., who has also had, I think, a wonderful camp in terms of like taking that next jump in his development from like being a 7th round pick and basically being an afterthought last season. I don't think that it's a shoo-in that Javon Bullard starts opposite Xavier McKinney when the season starts at all. I think Evan Williams could absolutely make that case if he continues to stack preseason games the way that he did on Saturday. So we've talked a ton about that is not going to be a static position either. It's going to be heavily rotational, depending on who their opponent is, what kind of defense Jeff Hafley wants to call in any given game. So again, this is not like a Javon Bullard versus Evan Williams conversation by any means. Just getting to see the two of them and what their like strengths are really in these games is awesome. It's just, I think, a little bit more obvious what Javon Bullard's skills are. We knew that going into the draft and we're coming out of the draft, and we've been able to see it a little bit more in practice and again in this game. But Evan Williams, at least to me, was a little bit more of a question mark. So I really enjoyed watching him play.
Yeah, I mean, he led the team in combined tackles. He tied, I think it was, Raylan Goforth, the like 6th or 7th on the depth chart inside linebacker. The two of them both had 6 combined tackles. He had the forced fumble, which was really impressive. And I mean, Rob Domofsky, it was reported, you saw it live, but there were some looks in nickel where it was Evan Williams and Xavier McKinney deep and Javon Bullard in the slot. So I know that Keyshawn Nixon tweeted today that he's the nickel, and I think that he generally is for the bulk of those defensive looks. But I do think there's going to be some packages that they mix it up. I think, like you said, Anthony Johnson Jr. has played well enough to warrant taking some snaps, whether it's in dime packages or certain like big nickel packages. But I think Evan Williams and Javon Bullard both have played really well. And it's been a lot of fun to see them develop because I genuinely, you said it, can't remember a time that we've seen a position go from the biggest liability to such an overhaul. Anthony Johnson Jr. is the only one that was left, and I mean, Benny Sapp, kind of, if you count, being around for the training camp last year. But yeah, just complete overhaul of the position, and he's played really, really well. So before we talk about more players that stood out to us, I did think it was really interesting because there's obviously the fifth safety that we have yet to see take any defensive snaps. Katan Oladapo didn't take any defensive snaps, but played 45% of special team snaps. So I think special teams, especially given, Rich Bisaccia as their assistant head coach at this point, special teams are going to be like the inside track to the roster because a lot of the starting positions are locked in. So I wanted to kind of run through really quickly what the special teams distribution snaps looked like against the Browns. Ben Sims played 75% of defensive snaps. So you're talking about likely your third or fourth tight end competing with Tyler Davis, who wasn't able to play. Tyler Davis has been a special teams guru his entire career, hasn't played much on offense. So if Ben Sims is starting to like usurp him for special team snaps, I think that's going to be a really big competition. Zane Anderson, 55% of special team snaps, has never played a defensive snap in his 3-year career. Has only played special team snaps. Oladapo and Kalen King and Christian Welch, all 45% of snaps. Aaron Mosby, the edge rusher. And then Evan Williams, again, 40% of snaps. Jamon Green, the backup corner. And then Eric Wilson was 35% of snaps after playing 72% of snaps on special teams in 2023 for the Packers. So I'm curious to see kind of what happens with Wilson because we don't know if Cooper and Hopper coming back will take away some of his role on defense. But a lot of these guys that are playing a ton of special team snaps, you can tell that they're trying to carve out those really particular roles for themselves.
Well, that's always the way that a fringe roster player kind of makes their way onto a team. If they're not going to be playing on the two sides of the ball, it's how can I make, a statement or be productive for my team, and it's special teams. And you mentioned it, there's guys that have literally in their entire career only played on special teams, and that's like what their career has been. I do wonder the Katan Oladapo case being like, is it coming back from injury? Is that part of it? That would be an interesting, if I was in the media room, it would be a question I would ask.
I think
what
that
the case is for that.
I can't remember who asked it, but I think somebody said, like, are they going to work him back slowly? And Matt LaFleur basically said, like, yeah, that's the plan. So I think it's one of those, like, you see it a little bit in training camp. I know Andy said he had a PBU during one of the practices, but yeah, I would imagine that we'll see him play more in week 2, especially now if we're talking about the starter sitting. I think there'll be more snaps to go around for some of these bottom guys. So let's talk about then fringe players that are making a case for themselves either positively or negatively with their stock going down here.
Okay. Give me your first guy.
Okay. My first one is, we kind of talked about it a little bit already. Bo Melton. And I don't necessarily think that it's like all of a sudden he's not on the team. I still have him in my 6 for the wide receiver room. So I think that he's shown enough to warrant, sticking around. And I think the team really likes him. And somebody had posted a video of the sidelines of all the receivers and Jordan Love going over to check on him after some drops. Like, there's an accountability and a closeness with this team that, he knows he has to play better. And I think he certainly will do that. But it's just unfortunate for a guy who had such a strong kind of rookie season, being one of those fringe players coming in and making a name for himself, to then have a little bit of a disappointing performance when you do have a guy like Grant DeBose on the other side that's really ascending. and potentially looking at stealing one of those spots. So I don't necessarily think he's in jeopardy of losing a roster spot, but I think that he could be like 51 or 52 when you're talking about guys that get the final phone call when you're looking at making that roster.
The heat is on, is how I see it. Like the pressure is on, he is on. He stands the most to lose for sure, since it's not necessarily a lock for him to make the team, which is crazy given what he was able to do over the course of the season. But it's a good reminder of like, you have to continuously make your case and fight, because there's always going to be you guys who are doing the same thing every single day, every single practice.
All right. Do you have a stock down or a stock up here?
I have a stock up, but it's definitely going to warrant a conversation around potentially other players who might have a stock down. Okay. I want to talk about Emmanuel Wilson, because he's definitely stock up right now. We mentioned him earlier in the Sean Ryan conversation. He played real snaps last season in games, right, until he got hurt. So I don't think it should be too much a surprise that he's making a case to make the team again, especially since he was kind of on the rise until an unfortunate injury derailed that progress. The running back room behind Josh Jacobs it's still very open, because you'd like to think that Marshawn Lloyd has the running back 2 thing locked up, given like draft, etc. But I just don't think he does yet. Unfortunately, he looks great, but then he pulls his hammy. He's been kind of in and out of practice, obviously in and out of this game. We as people, fans watching, media watching, are high on him simply because of the potential, but not because of anything that he's shown yet. AJ Dillon is in the conversation, but also not necessarily a roster lock for a multitude of reasons that we've discussed again. And he didn't have like the greatest game. He's riding past, history with the team. He's riding other strengths that he has: pass pro, pass catching, reliability, durability, I'd say like ball security, a number of other things, but did not have a showing that to me was like, oh, AJ Dillon is making his case for this team. That's not what Saturday was. The only running back that did was Emmanuel Wilson, who had like a productive game. So for a group that I think running back 2, 3, 4, all of those are up for grabs right now. And for an offense where we know that rotation, go grab it, Emmanuel Wilson.
Yeah, I agree. I think that he's got to be right in that conversation. And it's tough, right? Because AJ Dillon, Adam Stenavich said like all the guys have to play with better pad level. The offensive line got more comfortable as the game progressed. He was taking snaps when they were still kind of shuffling. But then you look and there were some holes that he could have probably hit. I could not have run through them, right? But an NFL running back should have been able to hit that hole, and it didn't happen. So I know it's just one preseason game, but you have to wonder if he's going to keep playing more now with the preseason, or if they're going to look at the guys behind him, because I think that is where things get really interesting too. If the Packers don't play him the next 2 weeks, then he was a roster lock all along. But if he's out there in the second quarter of games, then you kind of wonder what they're still looking for. And I think there's also a case to be made with Marshawn Lloyd. We don't know how serious the hamstring is. By all accounts, we think he's going to be ready to go to Brazil. But if you're talking about an IR situation, then you feel like your running back room is kind of shaken out. You have your 3 guys, but then you're hampering Lloyd's development. So you don't want to put him on IR if you don't need to. So just a lot of question marks around that room. And one of, I think, the few position groups that really has a ton to shake out still.
Yeah. It's not for lack of bodies, but I think lack of the bodies seizing the opportunity that has been presented to them. And after Saturday, the guy that has stood out to me that has done that is Wilson so far.
Yeah. I want to talk about the quarterbacks because I think that there's a really big conversation here. And I'm sure we'll get into it more in the coming weeks, especially in Denver with Jordan Love not playing. You've got Sean Clifford and Michael Pratt probably each taking a half, you would imagine, of the game.
Mhm.
And of course, Sean Clifford led 3 pretty successful drives, had some throwaways. Michael Pratt kind of had to burn clock and take a knee and didn't get to maybe showcase as much as you would want him to be able to showcase. But I'm curious your thoughts on this because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what this room looks like. And I think the Packers really like both of their guys. But I don't know if they would be comfortable if something happened to Jordan if either one of them could win you an NFL game. And I Cleveland's got Tyler Huntley and Dorian Thompson Robinson. One of those guys is probably not making the roster because they already have Jameis Winston as their second. In like a Washington situation, you've got Jaden Daniels, and then you've got Marcus Mariota and Jeff Driscoll. I don't know if you're keeping all 3 of those guys. So like there's a debate around could you go pick up somebody like Tyler Huntley, who we saw win games when Lamar Jackson was not playing, if you want more insurance, but then do you lose the potential upside of developing a Clifford or a Pratt if somebody wants to go add them to their QB room?
I love that you asked this question. You definitely listened to our episode this morning because I talked about this with Andy. It's such a good question that I feel like nobody's talking about because who wants to talk about the backup quarterback? Because that's what this is, right? Nobody is vying for a starting QB in Green Bay. We have that. That's done. Put that on the shelf. So, and nobody wants to think about the question of if a quarterback has to step in for any stretch of games this season, can they go 2-2 or 3-1? And like, let's say Jordan Love, I'm knocking on all the wood, this hypothetical situation, nothing serious, pulls a hamstring, could happen, right? And is out for 4 games. Like, could either of these guys go in and win you a game? And I think you make an absolutely apt comment, which is probably not. And again, that's not why you drafted Michael Pratt. He is a developmental prospect. But also, if Sean Clifford going into the season is QB2, that would be your expectation for him, is to step up in that moment. And the answer to that question of can he is probably no. So to fringe players who are making their case versus potentially not making their case, I actually think Sean Clifford might be like not in a great position when it comes to like this roster and what the Packers are going to do moving forward, because they're going to keep Michael Pratt because, to your point, he is the developmental prospect. They probably don't want to lose out on him. They just drafted him. We know how you said it before, Goody feels about his draft prospects. But if they need to go win games, there are tons of backup quarterbacks out there to go grab. You could go get a Taylor Heineke.
Mm-hmm.
You just said it, you could go get Marcus Mariota. None of these are good options. We don't want any of these guys to be playing meaningful snaps for the Packers. However, shit happens. I mean, we saw the Bengals deal with it last season with Joe Burrow. We've seen it. It's a necessity, and it's a contingency plan that they have to have in place. They don't have a good one right now.
Well, I think what's so interesting too is knowing that the rules have changed a bit with the elevation of an emergency QB. You can technically have a quarterback on your practice squad that you can just elevate indefinitely. There's not like the 2-time rule. It's they can come up for every game. They can always be designated. So there's a possibility that the Packers, I don't think they would do this, but in an alternate universe, they could say, we're going to bring in Tyler Huntley to back up Jordan Love, and we're going to have 2 quarterbacks on our 53-man roster, and we're going to waive both Sean Clifford and Michael Pratt, and one of them's likely to stay, and they'll be on our practice squad, and they'll just be our call-up every week in a worst-case scenario. And again, that's not the Packers' style to do that. I think, probably for sure Michael Pratt is on the active roster, but you have to wonder, like, I don't think Michael Pratt is QB2. I think that if Michael Pratt is on the roster, they're keeping 3 quarterbacks on the 53. And if Sean Clifford is there, he's the person that they feel is comfortable being the backup. And that means that they're going to forego adding a vet. So that's why, Denver is going to
Yeah.
be really telling is what these guys look like taking more meaningful snaps. And it'll be exciting to see Michael Pratt play a little bit more because he kind of just had to run the game out, hand the ball off a lot. But there was a really fun Julian Hicks end around that I know they said that Pratt and Hicks have had like a connectional training camp. There was him lead blocking for Emmanuel Wilson, which was really fun. So it's cool to see some of these like really low depth guys making big moments.
And Michael Pratt deserves all of the opportunity to develop because that's all he should be asked to do right now. I don't think elevating him to any kind of like QB2 situation, unless they feel like that's where he's at, is necessary. But I never thought that I would be thinking about should the Packers go out and get a vet backup. But I am the thought is percolating for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is probably one of those situations where like a Joe Flacco thing, right? Like
Yeah.
until you're in the worst case scenario, you might not know. So the
Yeah.
Packers might not need to even care who's out there unless it's like cuz if it's like one game, I could see them rolling with Clifford, you
For sure.
know. But the Packers, when it was the Brett Hundley experience, it was like, okay, you knew that was going to be an extended period of time and you were expecting him to win a good chunk of those games to keep you in playoff contention. So we'll see. But yeah, it's really intriguing to think about the depth behind Jordan Love.
Yeah. Any other players that you think are kind of on the margins, either making a good case for themselves, undermining their case to make the team, or just anyone else that like stood out to you that we haven't mentioned yet?
One of the people for sure is Lucas Van Ness. If we're talking about a
Yeah,
sophomore jump, I think he has to be included in that. Yes, you could say he was playing against some backup tackles, but he looks the part of a first round pick, and it'll be fun to see him keep going, especially knowing that JJ Enagbari might not be full go to start the season. I think they're going to ask a lot of him. Not necessarily how they played, but seeing Quay Walker on some pressure looks was really fun because it gave me like a glimpse at what we think Jeff Hafley is going to do some more of. So really loved looking at that. But probably the player that stood out the most to me as far as like making a case and the positives is Robert Rochelle. And I think that he's just very much in contention with Valentine for like that sixth spot. I think Kalen King, given his draft stock, is the fifth guy. And I think it comes down to Rochelle and Corey Ballantyne for that sixth spot. And you would say probably the nudge goes to Ballantyne because he played really well in the absence of like Jair and, their starter Stokes. But Rochelle, I thought, had a really nice preseason and he's had some pretty good reps in training camp as well.
Yeah. I think it's going to come down to one of those things where who do they value on special teams between the two of them. But I'm glad you mentioned the depth at corner. I think another guy that I'm watching, at least for the rest of the preseason games, is Kalen King. He's at a really nice camp, and he's certainly making a case for himself to be next man up, if you will, if they ever needed somebody to fill in the cornerback room. The starters are set, but if they needed somebody, especially like if Carrington Valentine misses any like extended time or anything like that, to your point, he is probably in that fifth guy range. And I've really liked what I've seen so far.
I want to talk really quickly because I guess you could argue it's stock down for all of the room, but about the kickers. Because I think we've been waiting, right, for somebody to pull away. We've wanted all camp for somebody to just go like 95% on their field goals and just blow the other guy away so the Packers could feel comfortable saying, hey, week 1, 45-yard field goal to win the game. So-and-so goes out there and we feel comfortable. And I haven't felt that. I will say that I felt more comfortable when Greg Joseph has been out there. His kicks have looked a little more centered. Anders Carlson, his field goals in Cleveland looked like they were just maybe about to hit the upright and then snuck in. But I'm curious if you think that it's still just a battle to watch, if you have a comfort with either kicker, if you're worried about both of them, or like where are you feeling with special teams?
I think special teams and the care thing are two separate conversations. I agree with you. I think the kicker competition was like meant, at least in my mind, my view of it was, oh, they're gonna bring in some guys. This is gonna whip Anders into shape. He's gonna clearly pull away from everybody else as he should, and that'll be that. And that's not what's happening. And it is making me a little bit concerned going into the season. Other teams deal with a kicker rotation all the time and they are still fine. I think we have been incredibly spoiled for a long time with just steady consistency at this position. So there's a little bit of bias there for sure. But I would, to your point, just like to see someone grab this by the horns and say, this is mine and I'm taking it away. You tweeted out actually some stats today that were almost like disarming to me at how similar the Greg Joseph and Anders Carlson experiences are. Doesn't make me feel good about either of them, to be honest. So someone's going to have to step up. As far as the rest of special teams, it was fun to watch the new kickoff rules, or kick return rules, I should say. Going to have to get used to them for sure. Still not sure I understand them completely, if I'm being totally transparent with all of our listeners, but we will learn as the season goes on. And I think it's going to make for some fun. That I do know. I think there's going to be some good returns, hopefully less injuries, and that's what really matters. I would just like the Packers to be competent. I think they have a lot of talent at special teams. We've talked a ton about guys who are playing for special teams spots. There's ability there. We just got to put it all together. But the kicker is number one question mark right now.
Yeah, and I mean to kind of wrap up your point too about the new kickoff rules. I know we didn't get to really see like a full return because, they were touchbacks, but Emmanuel Wilson being back there on some punts too. I don't know if that was just because like Jaden Reed was sitting and Keyshawn was sitting, but I did think it was interesting that he was the guy out there. I wasn't sure if it would maybe be like a DeBose or a Bo Melton or somebody else that you thought maybe had a little bit higher of a chance of latching onto the roster. So I don't know if that's, a check in the positive column for him that they're giving him looks as a return man, or if it was truly just, hey, our 3 preferred starters are all sitting because they're starters on the team. So nobody's out there. But I did think it was worth noting that Wilson was the guy catching punts for them. Any other thoughts? Any other players that stood out to you? Positives, negatives?
No, I think we covered everything. I'm really glad LVN, you shouted him out because he definitely was on my list. But we will be back for the Broncos joint practices and previewing the game. Will definitely be interesting and different because, as Matt LaFleur said, the starters will not be playing. So more to watch in terms of fringe players trying to make the case for the team. And I think a lot more around kind of this discussion of who is standing out and kind of breaking away from the pack. And I'm excited to see who takes that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be back on Friday. The Packers will face off against the Broncos in Denver. It is a Sunday night game, which is rare for the preseason, it feels like, but Packers playing Sunday night. So we'll have that show for you, like I said, on Friday. Thank you, as always, for joining us. You can find the podcast on Twitter at PWSS Podcast, Perry at Perry_Goldstein, me at Maggie J. Loney. If you're listening to the audio version, thank you so much. You can find us everywhere you find your favorite podcasts. If you're here on YouTube with us, thank you so much for that as well. Please like and subscribe to the show because it really helps us out a ton. And we'll see you guys on Friday to talk about week 2 of the preseason. We are almost to the regular season. Go Pack, go.
Go Pack, go.